Well, welcome everyone. I'm doing the webinar from my home office tonight. It's a pleasure to be joining you all. We've got a few people still just arriving, so I'll just be reminding folks a couple of things at the beginning to where you can, you'll see a little icon there for your microphone. You just keep that on mute throughout the session, and that way it will it'll just keep it a clear noise and only my voice throughout. For questions near the end, or if there is questions, please type them in the chat box and I will be able to answer them as we go along. So as I do not have my trusty assistant Sam Higgins beside me, I'll be cumbersomely moving along through some of the practices. If we get to a technical difficulty, you'll see me at my best. But tonight, I suppose this was sort of the third in a bit of a trilogy, really, and it's going to weave the themes of the last two webinars. The first one was on complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or what we probably will see in the future as a developmental trauma disorder if we have Bessel-van der Kolk gets his way. While all that discussion takes place in the tall towers of psychiatry, places like South Pacific and treatment centres, and therapists work at the coalface with how people present. And as someone who's in recovery himself, I'm really grateful that when people met me at the door, they were letting that argument in the halls of sort of medicine take place about what was causing what, but they met me with tools that were working. So I suppose tonight some of the things I want to spend some time on is that we did the complex post-traumatic stress, and in that I got to talk about some of the things that I really wanted to put into this one. I've just come fresh from the second biannual Australian Childhood Foundation Conference. The first one was magnificent, and it was overshadowed by this one. There was speakers from around the world, Stephen Porges, people that have been listening to me for a couple of years in these webinars have certainly heard his work talked about with the polyvagal theory. Dr. Ed Tronick was there with the still face experiments. Alan Shaw was presenting with his significant work on attachment theory, affect regulation in the first 1,000 days, which has really given us some hard neuroscience in regards to Pear's wounded child, adult adapted child concepts. And then probably the most wonderful affective therapist I've ever seen with children, Dan Hughes, and his cohort and research, older fellow called John Balin. Both those men together were probably one of the best presentations there. The work of Pat Ogden and the somatic therapies, Peter Levine's work was being presented, and not to take away from Pat Ogden and everything she owns around sensory motor psychotherapy. All these folks working together was just amazing to watch, because what it is, they're coming together in community behind what I'm going to present to you tonight, which is how to get long-term recovery. Now, organically in AA and the bigger 12-step fellowships around the world, people have made these discoveries, and some of the work I'm going to present tonight is by Dr. Patrick Carnes. I saw that he's received a couple of awards for his work in the last few weeks, and I think it's bestowed upon someone who's brought a lot to the 12-step community. His focus has been on sex addiction, but because it's been a process addiction, they've been able to accumulate a lot of research, because there's still many professionals today that will sit in front of you and tell you that they don't believe that sexuality and things regarding sex can be an addiction. But we certainly do at South Pacific, and I think that tonight hopefully I can present some of the things in recovery that will steer people towards long-term recovery that can be helpful. So let me just move ahead. I've always liked this statement of Carl Jung's, that until you make the unconscious conscious, it'll direct your life and you'll call it fate. And I think what I like about it is when generally when people come into recovery, this phrase sums up Pierre Melody's concept on defense mechanisms, and the organic ones of childhood, the way the brain protects itself with suppression, repression and disassociation, and then the more sophisticated ways we protect ourselves with minimizing, denial, delusion, memory loss that can go sometimes with life-threatening trauma in our childhood. So when we arrive in treatment, we really are just arriving in this fateful state, this state that we think that we're just powerless over, that we can't amend or change, and in desperation, in Peter's words, through crisis and unmanageability, we end up at the doors of places trying to get someone to understand us. But I also like his statement here that I'm not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become, and I think that's recovery. And the juxtaposition between these 2 points of view is it still doesn't mean that what happened to us doesn't have a lasting effect. It's how I choose to deal with it. An alcoholic can choose to deal with his alcoholism by attending the pub and drinking, or can choose the 12-step fellowship and therapy and a completely different way of life, still with the very same start. And I think that when Pia Mellody arrived at these ideas of, look, there's an absolute powerlessness to how you experience yourself, but yet where you place yourself in recovery is significant, it starts to highlight where she got her model from, which certainly starts with what children need, how it gets interrupted, and then where you head from there. When she describes it, she says that what recovery takes is that we have to turn up, and it can sound like a ridiculous statement, but what it's always meant to me is that when I first walked into that NA meeting and I walked into that detox, I took myself there. I had to go, and I went there with the truth. And we're so used to turning up in adaptions from childhood traumatic situations that the adapted self. So I'm just muting one person there, so just forgive me for my losing my train of thought. So when we turn up, for many of us, especially with addiction or mental health issues, we've been able to either use drugs or process addictions to zone out, to disconnect. So when we turn up, we're a bit of the shell of the person that we could have been or was. So in recovery, when we turn up, it's pretty confronting. And the examined life's no picnic. The turning up's got to be followed by a decision. That decision for a lot of folks is highlighted in the third step with reminding us that if we don't make a decision to hand our will and our life over, to actually do something else, we will continue in this insanity at the second step, that could word in the second step. So turning up's not enough, and for some of you out there, you might have had that experience where we're going to meetings, we're attending the meetings, but we haven't joined the fellowship. We didn't get the sponsor, we're not working the steps, we're not having an in-depth look at ourselves, which is really what the steps are offering you. So the idea of turning up, the decision to grow up is one thing, but then to actually put the work in. So Pia's idea of turning up, a decision to grow up, and then facing our reality. And this is one of the things in recovery I think is the hardest thing. She makes the point, with especially underlying trauma and codependency, if you turn up and give up your addictions, you're giving in your medication. And then what you're left with is that pretty frazzled state, the post-acute withdrawal syndrome, all those, the sort of neurobiology of recovery. And we can feel fairly awful at times, just physiologically, let alone having years of inner critic sort of really writing the neuroprograms in our brain, years of storing feelings to a point where they're at toxic levels and states that then overwhelm our choices in behaviour. So this facing our reality is essential, but a lot harder than it sounds. If you go to the Meadows, which is the program that Bill and Lorraine Wood went to and had such one of those joy pain experiences that it was so powerful, they came back and brought this brought it to us in Australia. But the statement that you see on the wall there is by M. Scott Peck, who wrote A Road Less Travelled and many other powerful recovery books. And mental health is a commitment to reality at all costs. And so 12-step culture had that phrase early on of nothing can get in the way of our recovery, that if we put anything in front of it, that we risk losing the lot. And unfortunately, people learn those lessons in research as we go along, when we go back and think, well, maybe I can just do that one thing and manage it this time. And unfortunately, that can become part of our relapse story. So the two recoveries that Pia Melody suggests at the beginning. So if we're going to have long-term, establish and maintain long-term recovery, then the model would suggest that we need to be in recovery from our history, the impact of the developmental trauma, and in recovery from our disease. And the disease being, probably can inverted comma that and hyphenate it and just say the disease. For some of us, there's an absolute and fundamental affect dysregulation disorder as a result of developmental trauma. In other words, we have the symptoms of post-traumatic stress in our daily life today, triggered by things today, and it activates, as Peter Levine says, it's not something that doesn't activate our memory, it activates that nervous system that then responds to that data in real time now. And so with getting into recovery, we've got to look at these two ways of going about it if we want to establish it. Now, some people, she makes the point that some people can deal with their developmental trauma with a 12-step fellowship alone, and that usually is designated by if you don't feel too much pain or shame when you start to look at your own history. For some of us, that can disassociate, and that disassociation can happen not just as a response to sexual or physical abuse. If you were shamed or abandoned chronically, emotionally or intellectually, we can have dissociative states as a result of that. So if we think back and we think about childhood and we disconnect, that can be one of the reasons we might need to get support. That we become aware that there's those defenses of repression, suppression and disassociation and memory loss. So sometimes it is that therefore our body has been so good at disconnecting us from the pain, we can have those fateful experiences of that stress now, but we will then struggle to, I'm just doing a little bit of housekeeping, folks, my skills here on offer. We can struggle to, be in recovery and then have these feelings come up, because the easiest way to describe a disassociated state in our adult life now is we'll have emotional flashbacks, but we don't really know what it's connected to. It comes from a different part of our brain, our implicit memory. So if that's happening to us, we really need to get some extra support, and especially these days, because there's so much more we can do with it. And if we experience a lot of minimization, delusion and denial, now this is a hard one to sell to people because, excuse me, for a long time those defenses were a fantastic way of getting over childhood trauma. If I could look back, think of a painful memory, and it didn't affect me, where I go, oh, that's nothing, that happened to everyone in my school, everyone in the football team. I might have went to school and been abused, but that happened to a whole bunch of us. And interestingly, we might be able to just manage it. So we've minimized it. We're in denial it even happened pretty effectively, so we don't think about it. They might come up occasionally. Or we've even had an effective delusion that we've held on to, where we've told ourselves a story for so long that we believe it. This eventually will play itself out in either addictions, mental health issues, or physical health issues. And so if we've got those, that defense mechanism mightn't be the gift that we thought it was in the long term. I pulled the ACE study out of this presentation tonight, the slide I usually show on that. But essentially what we know about the developmental trauma, even if we're disconnected from it, the symptom of it is early death, that we're likely to die 10 to 20 years earlier than our peers as a result of that energy and stress and trauma trapped in our bodies. So sometimes that disassociation is a little bit like maybe a sports person playing with an injury, and they take a needle and they continue to play with the injury, and for a while they feel as though they're okay, but essentially more trauma is going into that area of the body, they just can't feel it. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the model, which there's just some of you out there that have heard me talk about it before. They know that I find that hard to do. So I want to take you through the story of it very quickly, because this was delivered last webinar. Pia starts with a hypothesis that was once experiential in nature, that we now know just sitting in a masterclass with Dr. Alan Shaw last week, and hearing that, you know, every time you sit with those guys, there's more and more research, because it's a very popular topic now, because we're starting to get to the bottom of how to help people the most. She's basically saying that children need to be valued age appropriately over time, about their whole reality, body, thoughts, feelings, behavior, that they're vulnerable in their reality, body, thoughts, feelings, behavior, that they're perfectly imperfect, age appropriately, perfectly imperfect, that they're dependent, that the parenting tip of doing for, help do, and stand back and support. And when a child is being valued, their vulnerability is protected, that they're being engaged in about their reality, that their needs and wants are observable to the parent, caregiver, or the person themselves, the child themselves. If that environment and atmosphere is created, a child is going to be open and spontaneous in their nature. That if they're, you know, right from the very early gaze, as a child starts to develop, as they gaze out and they see someone with their upper vagal social engagement system and gazing back in, before they can even get their left and right integration, their body under 12 months is creating the chemical infrastructure to let them know that they're being soothed. And so they have a need, they express it, they're soothed. They have a need, they express it, they're soothed. That's what creates that spontaneity, that ability to trust that inherently, at an organic level, we're going to be looked after. So children need this. It's not a nice to have. This is a need, age-appropriate need, for them to maintain and develop certain beliefs. Those beliefs essentially are eventually the ability, the growing ability is in our adolescence and childhood, and then as an adult to have inherent worth, self-esteem, to be able to have a separate grid when it comes to our value relationally with others. So I can't stress this enough, because with Pia Melody, she says that the most obvious symptom of developmental trauma is low self-esteem. That we either go to a chronic less than position or better than position, or bounce between the two. At a cellular organic biochemistry level, and it's a felt sense, a stress can be in our body as a result of seeing the world as something that is unsafe. Fundamentally, we're on a vigilance. This can be experienced as a mental health issue like low-level anxiety. John Bradshaw made the point that if you've experienced developmental trauma, then you will at least have a general anxiety disorder. Boundaries, personal boundaries, external, internal, and sexual, really important. Without those, we will be an offender or a victim, and there's no in-betweens. We will not be able to just find a place as social creatures where we, without boundaries, are not going to injure our relationships and allow others to injure us. That we get a good sense of our own reality. And when Pia Melody in the resource Mapping Your Recovery talks about how do you know if you're in your recovery from codependency, she makes the point that, well, in regards to your reality, your body and that sort of central nervous system, your the cognitive thoughts, defenses, all the ways that you interpret the world, the feeling states that you have, the choices and access to behaviours, it's a centeredness that that people feel that they're in relationship with themselves to the core. Now, when working with many people with developmental trauma, sometimes accessing your body is really difficult. They either feel nothing or everything all at once. So that idea that recovery gets us back to having a center is sort of exciting for both and frightening for most. That we have in regards to our dependency, we know that children can be in their dependency, they get those needs met, that they're dependent human beings, that sometimes we need to access others for support, sometimes we can generate it ourselves, but essentially our needs and wants are observed, identified, and are important. And for anyone that's got that, just that workaholism or busyholism, they know that we can turn off basic needs. We can turn off sleep, we can turn off nutrition, we can turn off some basic ones, let alone more sophisticated ones. So essentially, if we can self-esteem, have boundaries, are centered in our reality and meet our needs and wants, that'll be seen as moderation. you'll see people basically making fairly balanced choices as they go through life. So the thing that interrupts this here is this developmental trauma. The webinar I did two ago goes into this at depth. I could always talk about this, especially after last week. You know, I spent some time with Professor Martin Tescher last week in a master class, watching him talk about it's not just the different parts of the brain that were damaged, but the connecting fibers and the information channels between those parts of the brain. There was the Italian professor Vittoria that was responsible for discovering the mirror neurons that we have. He still has some arguments in the psychiatric community about that, but not in the community I spent last week with. That the idea that my parasympathetic nervous system is going to react to yours. The work of Dan Siegel, where he now talks about the idea that there's the I and the you and the we, and that we come together in relationship. So here, Pia really just, I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but she's never held the belief that it was sexual and physical abuse that just caused developmental trauma. She said that in the 80s we need to broaden the concept of the impact of trauma to include emotional, intellectual, and what she called spiritual abuse. When somebody's in a family system where they put themselves above the family rules, that they're self-centered in their own nature, and so a child has to participate in a relationship with the adult to make the adult comfortable. As I said, the ACE study finally gave us the data that we needed to tell us that that sort of abuse left people with post-traumatic stress, and the impact on the brain can be seen through MRIs as the same sort of trauma impact as physical and sexual. So for all those people over the years that came through the Changes program and equivalent program, survivors at the Meadows, that sat next to a peer that had sexual or physical, and they only had emotional and intellectual, and that shame that you feel when you think, well, what's wrong with me? Surely I didn't even get hit. What's wrong? And it's I suppose encouraging to have that evidence that those folks, we were right to encourage them. That before we had this neuroscience, I remember saying, 20 years ago in Changes, when I used to run, it was called Survivors back then, that we don't see trauma that way, and it's nice to be right about that.